Oh, okay, very good. So our portion today is VaYeshev. Often it is the portion read on Shabbat Hanukkah. If it's not VaYeshev, it would be Miketz. And sometimes it's both, because 8 days of Hanukkah, you could sometimes have 2 Shabboses for Hanukkah. So it's usually one of these portions for Hanukkah. Good morning, Diane. So VaYeshev is on page 226 in the Eitz Chaim, whatever Chumash you're using, chapter 37, verse 1. And the blessing for Torah study, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech olam, shekidshanu b'mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Now, the past few portions, we've noticed that the chapter and verse with which the portion begins seems like we're in the midst of a chapter. Just a second, 2 more people coming in. Hi, Bill. And hi, Jan. Okay. Just getting started, the portion VaYeshev. So as I said, the other portions that we've been doing the past few weeks, the portion seems to start in the middle of a chapter. Here we're starting at the beginning of a chapter, but we still need to look at the context, to understand why the portion begins with the word VaYeshev. So again, we're on page 226 in the Eitz Chaim, chapter 37, verse 1, in the Torah, whatever edition of Chumash you're using. So VaYeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv. Jacob settled. So settled is a better word. I was going to say sat, but that would be yashav. In other words, to sit in a chair, that would be yashav. VaYeshev is just a different form of that means better settled living, that kind of word, as opposed to sitting. So in other words, the bracha for being in the sukkah is leishev basukkah. It's not lashevet, to sit in a sukkah. It's leishev, to settle, to dwell, to spend time. Okay, so that's the impact of the word VaYeshev. Yaakov settled, spent time, be'eretz migurei aviv, in the land of the dwellings of his father. That could mean the different places throughout the land of Israel that may be his father, and this could also mean Abraham. It's not necessarily his father, it could be his ancestors, but that's Isaac and Abraham at least. And so we know that Abraham and Sarah traveled around the land of Israel, and Isaac and Rebekah did as well. So Jacob settled in the land of the dwellings of his father, Be'eretz Canaan, in the land of Canaan, what is today the land of Israel. So we need this in context, because if we turn to the end of last week's portion, Vayishlach, in chapter 36, we have similar phrasing. We have chapter 36 is devoted to pointing out the genealogy of Esau and his descendants and future kings of Edom. So the Torah does do this detour to highlight Esau, Jacob's twin brothers, history. And in doing so, it tells us, beginning with verse 6 on page 216, just welcome, Elizabeth. We just started with VaYeshev, but I'm turning back to chapter 36 for the context where we have a similar word of VaYeshev. So chapter 36 again is the history or the future, the descendants of Esau. Beginning with verse 6, Esau took his wives and his sons and daughters, and all the men, it says page 216, and all the members of his household, his cattle, and all his livestock, and all the property that he had acquired in the land of Canaan, and went to another land because of his brother Jacob. Okay, so they didn't want to live together in the same land, so he went off in his own land. 7, for their possessions were too many for them to dwell together, kind of reminding us of Abraham and Lot way back in the portion Lech Lecha, where their household and their flocks were too much for the land that they were sharing together. So Abraham says to Lot, you choose. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. So here we have the same idea of because their possessions were too many for them to dwell together, just letting more people in. And we're just looking at chapter 36 as a tangent as we started the portion VaYeshev. We're on 2:16 in the Eitz Chaim. So Esau and Jacob split, for their possessions were too many for them to dwell together, and the land where they sojourned could not support them because of their livestock. Verse 8, VaYeshev Esav Bahar Seir Esav hu Edom. So Esau settled. So there you have VaYeshev in verse 8 of chapter 36, and then giving us history. Now, chapter 37, our portion, VaYeshev, page 226, VaYeshev Yaakov, so telling us now where Jacob is living, and similar to verse 9, Ve'ele toldot Esav, this is the line of Esau. Verse 2, Ele toldot Yaakov, this is the line of Jacob. Okay, so this is why chapter 37 is beginning this way, because of what we just read with Esau's line. So it's the very same words, very same structure, except we're going to have a story now from chapter 37 to the end of Genesis, where this can be a unit unto itself, focusing on Joseph, the whole Joseph story. And I still remember the intro to this in the Hertz Chumash. So if you have the Hertz Chumash, just read the intro there about the kind of literature that these chapters now, 37 to 50, these 13 chapters can be a story unto itself. So as opposed to just listing names and names of children and grandchildren, etc. in chapter 36, we have names also, but stories surrounding their lives. And that's the difference between the genealogy with Esau and the little genealogy that we have with Ishmael too. The Torah provides the genealogy of them for us just because they were listed as being born, and they are important people as extended people who had been born into the covenantal family and left. Still, the Torah will tell us a little bit about who they become, but the focus with events in the lives of our ancestors is what's important, and that's what makes up the history, the line of Jacob. Okay, so now we get into the heart of the matter with introducing us to Joseph. Ele toldot Yaakov, this is the line of Jacob. Yosef ben Sheva Esrei Shana, Haya ro'eh et achav batzon, Vehu na'ar et b'nei Vilha, ve'et b'nei Zilpa, Neshei aviv, Vayave Yosef et dibatam ra'ah el avihem. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended the flocks with his brothers. Haya ro'eh et echav batzon. So the et there is being used in an unusual way. Here it's being translated as meaning with. Et usually is a word that doesn't mean anything. It's used for grammatical purposes, usually to point out a noun that is immediately following that word. And that's as much as I'll get into grammar. Don't want to get into grammatical details, just wanted to point out that the word et here is just being used in an unusual way. So Joseph was 17 years old, and he was a shepherd with his brothers of the flock. And he was, so it says here, translating Na'ar as a helper to the sons. It could mean he was younger than, but a Na'ar usually means lad, a young man, an adolescent. There are different words for people as they grow older. So there's Yeled, there's Na'ar, there's Ish, as different words here. So Na'ar is usually used for a particular stage in life. In other words, all of us on the screen today could not be called Na'ar. Okay, we are too old for the category of Na'ar. And I'm including everybody on the screen here, from the youngest on the screen to the oldest on the screen. We could not have the term Na'ar applied to us. Now, we could have it applied to, I'm thinking of my children. My youngest is 21 years old. Can you apply Na'ar to a 21-year-old? I really don't think so. It's usually for anyone under the age of 21. You could say later in the Torah, we're told, like, people are counted in the census from age 20 and older. So probably below the age of 20 is considered a Na'ar. Okay, so that's in one category. But the Na'ar, we're also told a Na'ar came, this unidentified youth comes to give Abraham some news, to give other people news in the Torah. So an unidentified young person who is a member of a household or a messenger person. So, and here it's being used as a helper, a young helper. So he was a young helper to the sons of Bilhah and to the sons of Zilpah, who were the women of his father. I go with that translation, women of his father, as opposed to wives of his father, because they were the concubines of Rachel and Leah first, Bilhah and Zilpah. Then they became wives. So he was working with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. So there are three each for them, right? Gad and Asher, a few others were from Bilhah and Zilpah. So he's helping out Bilhah and Zilpah's children, not Rachel and Leah's children. Well, he's Rachel's child, and he has a younger brother, Benjamin, which is the other child of Rachel. Leah's children are Reuben, Shimon, Levi, and Yehudah, the first four. And then there are a couple more that Leah has also. So he's not helping them, Reuben, Shimon, Levi, and Judah. He's not helping them. He's helping the Bilhah and Zilpah sons. And Vayave Yosef, and Joseph brought et dibatam, bad reports, Ra'ah el Avihem, of them to their father. Okay, so as we are introduced here in verse 2, so Eile Toldot Yaakov, this is the line of Jacob. And we're just not told a name. We're told Joseph and what Joseph's place in the family. And it doesn't seem to be such a great place in the family. We are, the author of the story, the narrator, is telling us right away what kind of role Joseph has in the family. So what can you tell from verse 2? What can you tell me the narrator is trying to tell us about Joseph, the kind of person he is? unmute yourself for whatever comment you can say. What is the Torah telling us about Joseph here? What kind of person was he, and why? And also think why are we doing this? Why is it focusing on Joseph?
He was a snitch.
He was a snitch. Okay, so as an unusual. So again, by introducing the verse of saying this is the line of Jacob, we're told immediately Joseph. We're focusing on Joseph, the second youngest, and that he's a snitch. Okay, so just yes. What else can we say about Joseph here?
He's a little bit immature.
Possibly he's immature. Usually snitches in the family could be seen as immature, right?
Because my translation here has some additional things. It said he did like boyish things, curling his hair, touching his eyes to look attractive. So he's like, I don't know. So
that's the commentary. That's the commentary saying that?
Oh, no, in my Chumash, that's actually in the translation.
Oh, that's not good, because that's not directly in the words of the Chumash at all. So you sure it's on the, are you using the art scroll?
No.
Yeah. What edition are you using?
Chabad.
Chabad. I don't mean, by laughing in that way, I don't mean to make any disparaging comment about it. I only mean to say that some translations, the point of the translation is to present a particular story. So what it sounds like Chabad does, by you sharing that translation just of this verse, is that Chabad incorporates Midrash into the translation, so that when you're reading the English translation, not the Hebrew, but the English translation, you the reader, not just you, Jan, anybody who reads the Chabad translation will think that what you're reading is in the Torah, but it's not in the Torah, Jan. What we get that impression of Joseph doing himself up. We'll see that a little bit later in the in this portion, in which he's described as Yefei Toar, a beautiful, handsome man. But right here, there's nothing about that. There's not. So I just want to point out the risks of using the Chabad translation, because it's not a translation just as a translation. It's a translation that adds more story to than what is there in the Torah. Okay.
If I may add something.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
I've noticed in my very limited contacts with our Orthodox brethren, that there's a tendency to consider Midrash as if they're as sacred as the Torah itself. And the Midrashic elements like this one come into the text as part, regarded as if they were Torah Sinai.
Yes, so that's absolutely true. And there are some who think that whatever the Midrash tells us, especially about our patriarchs and matriarchs, that is as true to the Torah as the Torah itself. That's what the rabbis who wrote the Midrash want us to think, but as conservative rabbis, as my father and I are, and other non-Orthodox rabbis will teach, they will say Midrash is just one interpretation of the Torah. It's not the interpretation that we need to accept as truth. It is because it was written 1800 years ago, the Midrash, or 1500 years ago, it's been part of Jewish tradition for that long. Rashi quotes Midrash in his interpretation of the Torah. And it's only in newer editions of Rashi that you will see the citation in Rashi for where in Midrash he's getting it from. Because the older editions of Rashi do not have a citation. He just quotes saying, they say davar acher. He would say often another another interpretation and just quote the interpretation from the Talmud or from Midrash without saying in his words himself where he's taking it from. Editors of Rashi will say this is from somewhere in the Talmud or somewhere in the Midrash. So it's thanks to Rashi that he perpetuates some of the Midrash as well. So, but we just have to understand, and it's hard to understand it, Jan, and I'm not picking on you, Jan. I'm just picking on the translation that you're mentioning. We have to be very careful with translations that we use. Because I've been pointing out every week so far issues with our English translation of the Eitz Chaim, and how this is the new Jewish Publication Society translation, which is meant to be a scholarly translation, is not literal. And I don't blame the editors of the translation for not being 100% literal, because if they were, it would be awkward English phrasing. The sentence wouldn't flow right. So I can understand them wanting to make the sentence flow better, to read better in English, but the problem with that, and the problem with any translation, is that you lose something from the Hebrew. What Chabad is doing is adding to the Hebrew to give the impression that that's what's in the Torah too, and it's not in the Torah at all. Okay.
What's also interesting is that some of the times when you say the difference in the way that it's translated in the Eitz Chaim versus translated from the Hebrew,
yes,
the English in this one is more true to what you're describing,
okay,
versus what's in the book. So
okay.
It's kind of interesting to me to see the difference.
Yeah.
Because like you said, the first line, Yaakov settled in the land, which his father inhabited, the land of Canaan. That's exactly how that first line is translated here.
Right.
Which is what you translated, but not exact from what you said from Eitz Chaim.
Right.
So it's kind of
so
interesting,
Chabad,
the two views on the translation.
Yeah, so the Chabad, well, see, but again, the ideal would be to read the Chabad translation with a pretty fluent knowledge of the Hebrew of the Torah. So then one would understand that the English that they are translating is literal, and then that they're also adding extra words to. So that's the challenge with some translations. You know, if you just Google any verse of the Jewish Bible, just Google that and then click on that to do a search of that verse, tons, and literally tons of translations will come up on your screen. And there are some sites that even put lots of translations onto the same page. And it's just fascinating to see how different, and especially with the Christian Bible. There's the revised version, there's the standard version, there's the revised standard version, there's the new revised standard version. So they're all different so-called official translation of the Christian Bible, which gets to, of course, understanding, you know, especially about the life and times of Jesus, understanding some of those things. And also, you know, his Sermon on the Mount and things like that. How do you translate, you know, turn the other cheek, or some basic foundational Christian principles? If you just look at those different translations and say, oh, that's interesting. Because there's even a question, what was the original language of the Christian Bible? Was it written in Greek? Was it written in Hebrew? Was it written in Aramaic? And then, so Torah is written in Hebrew, and it's Torah Hebrew as opposed to Rabbinic Hebrew, as opposed to medieval Hebrew, as opposed to modern Hebrew. So yes, if you are a modern Israeli today who has never studied Torah before, you read the Torah, you could understand 90% of it. So there are Hebrew words here that aren't used in modern Hebrew, and so you need the translation. And then you get the rabbinic interpretation and the commentary to help you put this all in context. So back to this, I wanted to point out with.
Jonah, if I could
yes, go ahead, Gabe.
Is there a for the conservative movement purposes, Is there a hierarchy of translations that are
Oh,
true to
that's
the?
interesting. Right. So that's a good question, Gabe.
The same thing goes for Talmud. You've got the yellow Stein salts. You've
Oh,
got the
yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll
the-
answer that. Yep, I got it. So for when it comes to Chumash, before the 90s, well, this our Eitz Chaim, I'm just looking at the front of it, is published in 1985. Okay. So, and then, oh no, the English translation is 1985. The Chumash itself, 2001. Okay. So before 2000, every conservative synagogue, I'll say 90% of conservative synagogues, at least, or 95% would use the Hertz Chumash, the blue one. If you remember coming to shul, what that was like, we'd have the blue Chumash at the seats. Right, what Barbara is holding up. Right, usually without that paper cover on it. So if you take the paper cover off, because I don't think we ever had those in the seats with the paper cover, but you take the cover off, it's blue. So Rabbi Hertz is one of the first, exactly right, Barbara. So Rabbi Hertz was one of the first graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary when it was an Orthodox institution, and became the chief rabbi of the British Empire. And he wrote this translation and commentary that was considered a modern commentary, in that he incorporated both Midrash and the traditional rabbinic medieval commentaries in his commentary, plus the so-called scientific commentary, documentary, hypothesis, and other scholarly understandings of Torah. Like if you just look in Hertz as he explains the 10 plagues, he'll explain them scientifically. Like there may have been a volcanic eruption that could explain the 10th plague. The plague of the plague of blood could be silt in the Nile River. So this is unusual for a rabbi to comment on the Torah in such a scientific way like that. But so that allowed Hertz to be used in non-Orthodox synagogues as kind of a modern translation. So as in terms of an official translation or edition for the conservative movement, there's no official one, Gabe. This is a unique to the Eitz Chaim, is unique to the conservative movement because the conservative movement spent the money to publish its own edition that would be edited by leading scholars and rabbis of the conservative movement. So just look at the beginning, you'd see David Lieber, may he rest in peace, from what was then the University of Judaism, Harold Kushner, David Wolpe, Chaim Potok, people like this, who are leaders and scholars in the conservative, who are scholars, and some Jeffrey Tigay for some, and Fishbane for. These are scholars who happen to be graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary or teach at the Jewish Theological Seminary, so that their commentary, which is part of the conservative movement, gets incorporated into the Chumash itself. So within the Orthodox world, you have a Chabad Chumash that Jan is pointing out to us, Art Scroll, which is the main publishing house that publishes Orthodox-oriented prayer books and Chumashim. There's what's called the Stone Chumash, because a family by the name of Stone donated the money to support that translation of the Chumash that many Orthodox synagogues use. So so I wouldn't say, Gabe, that this is the official Chumash of the conservative movement, but it is the preferred one. And when it got published, we, like all conservative synagogues, went out of our way to try to get them into the seats. The same with the Siddur. The Siddur we use has a uniquely conservative movement bent to it, as opposed to all Reform synagogues using what is now Mishkan Tefillah, and Reconstructionist synagogues using their own Siddur. and Orthodox synagogues using different Orthodox rabbi edited Sidurim. They all have a particular take to it. So and the importance of the Sidur is the commentary to the Sidur to understand the theology of it and explain it in a conservative movement kind of way. Same here with the Torah, to explain it in a conservative movement kind of way, especially with the halacha, the gray box that we have on some pages that adds understanding of Jewish law from that particular verse. And also understanding, how do we put in context the role of women in the Torah, understanding that according to the conservative movement. And some of the other theological challenges in the Torah are explained in a conservative movement kind of way. When it comes to the Talmud, there's no official conservative movement translation of the Talmud, Gabe. That's not the case. And it's those in the conservative movement, those rabbis and educators who teach Talmud will use what you were talking about. What I have here, this is the first go round of Steinsaltz translating the Talmud. And then there's a newer translation that is, this is Steinsaltz also, but it's what's called the Koren Publishing House finished that whole thing. So that's the preferred Talmud used because it's a great English translation, which fills in the gaps that from other translations that are basically an outline form. There was another translation. The first English translation of the Talmud was from the Sonsino Publishing House, Sonsino Press, and this is over 100 years old, the translation. And the translation's good, but it's more, you really have to be a Talmud scholar to understand it, because the Talmud is written in outline form. So the translation comes across as an outline as opposed to filling in the gaps. Anyway, we go astray.
That goes for the Art Scroll as well.
Oh, the Art Scroll will have. So I haven't really looked at the Art Scroll translation. I would. I think the Art Scroll translation of the Talmud, when it comes to translating Talmud, there's not really an issue when you're translating the Talmud as to impact on understand. Now let me say it this way: when you're translating the Torah is the foundational text on which everything else is based in Judaism today. Okay, so we understand that we have to pray from the Torah. We understand that we do Shabbos, we keep kosher from the Torah. Torah's foundational text. So you want to be sure when you're translating the Torah and commenting on it to add your perspective to the Torah itself. The Talmud is just a text that's part of the Jewish tradition, rabbinic literature. So when it comes to translating that, yes, there could be some commentary you would add that would say, this is how we understand this today. And the Art Scroll will do that in terms of adding practical halacha to it, which would be Orthodox halacha. The conservative movement hasn't done that. There was one brief moment where the United Synagogue, was this? No. Yes, the United Synagogue participated in a translation of the Talmud in these paperback, very thin paper editions of translations of the Talmud. I have some of them here, the different colors for different sections of the Talmud. It was a daunting task to do that, and they just ran out of money when they did that. But the point would be to add some kind of conservative movement perspective to this translation. It's a shame that they ran out of money in that project, but that's Yeah, so the teacher then who's using the translation would have to provide that perspective in the class. Okay, so I am glad, Jan, that you brought out that Chabad translation. And I'm sorry for going on such a lengthy tangent about it. But I think it is important for us to understand when we interpret Torah that we should keep in mind that the interpretation we're reading is not ever to be considered the interpretation. The conservative movement approach is that we continue to interpret, not when it even when it comes to Jewish law, that rabbis continue to evolve and understand Jewish law. Just look at Zoom in the age of COVID and what that has done to Shabbat practices, right? Even me personally, I never use a computer on Shabbat until July when we started to Zoom, right? And so my Jewish practice continues to evolve. And so we should always read, even though we have a tradition that goes back 1,500 years of commentary in terms of the Midrash, that we should never consider that interpretation is the interpretation that we need to accept. It's just one type of interpretation in the history of interpretation of the Torah. Okay, and so the fact that I asked the question about what we can understand in verse 2 about Joseph, that's the way that we should always approach a text. I didn't ask the question, how did the rabbis understand Joseph in verse 2? How did the rabbis understand focusing on Joseph? I mean, we could do that, and it would be interesting just to read only the Midrash on this, but I think what makes it even better is that we ourselves have the right to interpret this text and to develop meaning from it, personal, spiritual, psychological meaning from the text. That the people that we read about in the Torah, even though they are important figures in Jewish history, they are people. And despite the lofty place that they have in Jewish tradition, they are people just like we are, subject to frailty and fault. And we can learn from the way they respond to the decisions they make in life, the good decisions and the bad decisions, and the impact that has on their family and future generations. That is a lesson to us too in our daily lives, that the decisions we make have an impact on ourselves, our families, and future generations. So it's very appropriate to read the story that way. And what was coming to mind as I was talking is that Lenore and I are almost done watching the 4th season of The Crown, and that is highly debated, I think, in England especially. Did the writers of that series go too far in humanizing the British royal family? Were they making up dialogue and events? Was that appropriate to do for the royal family, which are on a pedestal? And right, so it's lahavdil, as they say. Is it right to compare one to the other, the royal family to Torah? This is same ideas behind it in terms of understanding the people of the Torah, kind of the Jewish royal family, the first family. Is it appropriate to say some things about them that make them come off as not the greatest of people? So as we were saying about Joseph here, it's just fascinating that the story just delves right into it. We go right to Joseph. He's 17 years old, and we don't know how old Benjamin is, but Benjamin is a little bit younger to him. We're told that he's working for he's helping the sons of the concubines. And that's interesting too, that he's helping the sons of the concubines, as opposed to what would be considered the better sons, the sons of Leah herself. Why is he working with the concubine sons and not Leah's sons? That's a question that here is, it doesn't, even the commentary doesn't help us with that. But let's look at what the below the line has to say just about the beginning of this portion. The story of Joseph occupies the last 4 parshiot, the last Torah portions of Genesis, the longest single narrative in the book. So these 13 chapters, it's the longest segment, individual segment. It's the story of a young man blessed by God with a special grace, so that no matter what misfortunes befall him, he is able to surmount them. It's assuming that we know the story already. We've read it a few times in our lives. So we know that he's a dream interpreter. We know that he rises out of jail to become second in Egypt. But it's also a story of unintended consequences, of an effort to do harm that ended up doing good, and of an apparent triumph that set the stage for the Israelites' descent into slavery. On the surface, the actors in the story make their own way in life. In fact, however, it transpires that it is divine providence that is carrying out through mankind its own predestined plan. Right? So one aspect of this story that the Torah brings out is how much the events are controlled by God. And Joseph will say that too. My interpretation comes from God. He doesn't claim that he has this power on his own. So the role of God in intervening in history and making sure events happen a particular way, that's the perspective that the Torah has, which then some people can interpret to say that that's the way our lives work today too. That our lives, the things that happen in our life that we could say, oh, what a coincidence. Oh, how, like, for example, I re-met Lenore when I was in the library at the Jewish Theological Seminary my freshman year, the fall of my freshman year in rabbinical school. And there's Lenore, who we knew each other from 2 years prior when we were both at junior year at Hebrew University. And Lenore just happened to was in the library when I walked by. We sat down, we were talking, and she just happened to be doing research about a project on Jewish special education, and was looking for an article that my father had written that was published in some obscure periodical that she thought the seminary library would have, but seminary library didn't have it. So I said, oh, I think I can get a copy of that article for you. And so I called up my father, he copied it, sent it to me. And so you could think that that was just a coincidence, or you could think, well, God made it happen that I just happened to walk by at that moment and she just happened to be looking for an article, right? So it depends on our perspective, how we see events like this that are life-changing, right? And looking back 35 years ago, 36 years ago, actually, 1984, that when we met in the library. So, something that event led to now to look back on, you could say, oh, there might have been something a little bit more intensive or special that happened in that moment than just a coincidence of running into somebody that you might run into at the Jewish Theological Seminary. It's a central Jewish place in man. So I like what Susan wrote to me privately in the chat. That's what a rabbinical pickup line sounds like. Yes, I can get an article for you. That's right. Yes. Well, it worked, Susan. So it's okay, no matter how nerdy or geeky it sounds. Yes. So okay. So, but this is what what Nechama Leibovitz in her comment here below the line is suggesting. It's all perspective on how we understand why, if we ask the question of why events happen, I mean, normally we do ask that question, and sometimes usually there's no answer to why. One traditional religious answer is because God determined it to happen that way. And it works for good things. I don't mind saying God intervened to make me walk by the table in the library where Lenore is sitting, to say that because that's a good thing. I don't mind saying that God intervened to make sure that I walked by that table in the library that day. But God forbid, on the other end, bad things happen. You have to, philosophically, you have to be consistent in your argument. So if you're saying God intervenes for good things, you also have to say that God intervenes for bad things. And then you have to, then the challenge is whether you accept both the good and the bad that God's causing in our lives, and whether you want to believe in a God that would intervene both for good and for bad things that happen in our life. And that prompts different kinds of questions about theology. Yes, Susan, it looks like you want to ask a question.
I think that sometimes it's in the nuance in terms of how one imagines God intervenes, and I think about that something may happen that's very challenging or difficult, and then how I imagine that when I somehow muster the strength to remain in there and work with it, that's due to that's God's that's God's intervention. I mean, I think that again, in the same way we were talking about, like there's not one way to interpret. It can be nuanced.
Yes.
I'm thinking.
Right. No, absolutely, Susan. This isn't really the format to really be talking about theology necessarily, because we're not spending this is a Torah study class, and theology comes out of it. I'm just pointing out that there are challenges to theology and understanding. If we accept that there is a God, then how do we picture that God? And how do we picture our relationship to that God? And what is God's role in our life? All those questions lead to a variety of theologies that have been developed over the years. There is a rabbinic theology that is expressed through prayers that the rabbis wrote, and the Mishnah and the Talmud, so all from the rabbinic period of 100 BCE to 500 CE, you have that theology. Then you have theology from Maimonides and other medieval Jewish philosophers, and then post-Holocaust, especially other modern Jewish theologians coming up with a variety of theologies that will try to be consistent. That's the problem. Sometimes we're emotional. I don't mean that in a negative way. Sometimes we react with feeling to things that happen in our life, and we respond and we say, "Oh, God must have been here," like a birth of a child, or our wedding day, or these are moments in life, or at some place, a beautiful place in nature. We could say God is here, and we're responding in that moment, in that emotional moment. But then if you respond rationally, objectively, scientifically, then you come up with a theological system that's a little bit more challenging to come up with a system that would work and is satisfactory to you, both for in the good times and the bad times. So it's easy to believe in God in the good times. It's very easy to say, "Oh, thank God that I walked by the table in the library and saw Lenore. That's a good thing." Or thank God for the birth of my children, or for our wedding, or for the wedding of my son. All these things, thank God. But what about bad things that happen? Thank God for those. Of course, the rabbis say you have to thank God for the good and the bad, but the challenge is to living, as you're saying, Susan, living through the bad moments to see God in those moments too. Okay, so we're nearly out of time, and so the one other verse I want to look at is verse 3, which also sets the stage for this whole story of in the portion. Yisrael ahav et Yosef mikol banav kiven skunim hulo ve'asalo ketonet pasim. And Israel, not Jacob. So he's called Jacob in verse 1. He's called Israel in verse 3. His name will he'll be referred to back and forth, Jacob and Israel, and it's kind of hard to come up with a consistent idea. He's always Israel, called Israel at this moment. He's always called Jacob in that moment. It's kind of hard to say 100% of the time that theory as to why he's called Jacob sometimes and Israel sometimes, right? Abraham is always called Abraham after his name changed. Sarah is always called Sarah after her name changed. Jacob is not always called Israel after his name was changed to Israel. He's called Jacob again. Why is that? And why do we say Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov in the Amidah? Why don't we say Elohei Yisrael, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. So, right. So it's a question. If his name was changed, keep it to the name changed. Okay. So Israel loved Joseph from all his sons because he was the son of his old age. But Benjamin was the son of his old age too. And he made for him a garment. Well, it says here an ornamented tunic. Usually we have it, so, or it could be Andrew Lloyd Webber Technicolor Dreamcoat, which could be fine too as a translation, but pasim are usually stripes. So it's a garment, a tunic of stripes. So nothing about multiple colors here. That's just understood from interpretation that it was a multicolored garment. It was a garment of stripes. So this was the commentary above the line says an ornamented tunic. Such a tunic was a mark of high social standing, as is known from Assyrian inscriptions. Egyptian tomb paintings show Semitic men and women wearing multicolored tunics draped over one shoulder and reaching below the knees. Syrian ambassadors dressed in elaborately designed long robes wrapped around the body and over the shoulders. Others interpret it as a sleeved garment, a tunic reaching the wrists and the ankles. So maybe pasim there being sleeves. So Sarna, who's the Bible scholar whose interpretation is above the line, is pointing out that from archaeological discoveries, we know that such garments existed as garments for revealing the stature of the person in contemporary society at the time. Okay, so we didn't get nearly as far as I thought we would get today, but that's the beauty of Torah study, especially study with other people. That's the ideal when it comes to study, to bounce ideas off of each other and see where that takes us. So stay tuned for Shabbat morning when we will look at another section of this morning's Torah portion that is with Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar, and what that incident has for a future of Jewish tradition as well. So I wish everybody have a good rest of the day, stay safe and healthy, have a happy Hanukkah, which of course begins tomorrow night, and look for the links for, if you want, at 5:30 most nights, 4:25 on Friday before Shabbat, but 5:30 most other nights for coming together to light candles on Zoom. So happy Hanukkah, everybody. Have a good day.
Hanukkah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Sorry
you.
for getting us
Happy
off
Hanukkah.
track.
Thank
No,
you.
Jan, it's my fault, not yours. I could have just said, thanks for sharing, Jan, and I could have gone on. So it's okay, it's my fault.
Okay.
By the way,
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Welcome.
The Hertz translation says coat of many colors.
There you go. So